Okay, now Nigeria's fiscal deficits, there's a Fiscal Responsibility Act which places it about 3%. It gives a guidance of about 3% of GDP. We've exceeded that now. We're going towards 4%, towards the 4% benchmark. It's just the kind of situation which leads to shutdowns in the US. So ordinarily, if we had our eyes gazed on that, then we should possibly be talking about a shutdown. And then why do we have these kinds of fiscal deficits? Why are we getting to the 4% mark on GDP? On two major items in the recurrent expenditure, which is payroll, pensions, and overheads, Nigeria is already at a fiscal deficit. So we're already on a fiscal deficit, and interest payments, if I may add. We spend every 100 naira Nigeria earns, we spend 50 naira of it on interest payments. And then when you add the other components of recurrent expenditure, we already breach the entire revenues. We spend our entire revenues on recurrent alone. Interest payments 50% and other recurrent over 60%, about 65% altogether. So we're already 5% into a deficit on just two major items. We haven't even talked about capital expenditure. And we all know how much this country needs capex spending. So it's why every time we complain that we're not spending on capex, because we really do not have the financial capacity at this point to spend on capex.
Okay, so it doesn't matter when the government comes out and say, okay, for this budget of this year, we're taking it up to 30%, but then it's still an estimate,
yes,
and of course, finding the money to
exactly.
fund it is a
yes,
different
that's where
thing.
that's where the elephant.
Do you think that's why we always run into problems like the 2017 budget that that's come out with quite a poor performance?
Yes, that's where now the administrative issues on the budget management is separate, which is why we have late late passage of the budget.
Administrative issue. I mean, the actual funding.
Yes,
of
the
the
actual funding of the budget.
So
So that's what leads to the problem, and that's what no one in the room is addressing. So we keep saying why we're not spending on capex, but the truth is we do not have the capacity to spend on capex. And then if we throw in one new dimension, one new issue that is propping up as well, which is on fuel subsidies. The government, as much as possible, doesn't want to use that word subsidy. But the reality is that right now there's a subsidy. And if you speak with petroleum downstream marketers, they'll tell you that to get fuel to the last mile user, it's about 170, 175 naira right now, which means that for us to still be buying fuel at 145, then there's about a 20 to 30 naira subsidy right now on it, being financed by the NNPC. So how are we managing that fiscal risk as well? And why that's a problem is this. Once again, oil prices are on the rise. We're $60 a barrel on the average. And, we're pretty comfortable where we are on the face of it. But if we're going to spend all the gains on a rally on oil prices, once again on subsidy, which is another trillion. So we're looking at another trillion. That's outside the 3 trillion naira deficit. If we're to add 4 subsidies to that, then that's about 4 trillion in deficit.
But also in your report, you're also saying that, the petrol pricing, that's going to be the biggest,
yes,
you think that's the biggest issue?
Yes, that's the biggest issue, because how do we manage that? We lost time in 2015 all the way to this time when oil prices were anywhere between $30 to $45 a barrel. We actually missed out when we could have, deregulated. We could have also sold the refineries or done away with those refineries. They're dead and gone. Bury them and let's move on. But we didn't do any of these kinds of tough reforms. So what's going to happen this year is that downstream petroleum marketers have short tools in terms of importing. And all they're just doing is selling to the last mile user in the country. But who gets in the petrol? NNPC can't do it all alone. It's a monopoly first. The principles and economics of monopoly indicate that it wouldn't work.
Okay.
Right?
But let's move on from that. Now, you also said in your report that due to political risk, foreign portfolio investors would reevaluate Nigeria's risk profile and perhaps demand higher yields. Yes,
the basics of finance, the higher the risk, the higher the return. So, yes, expectations in terms of yield should go higher, which indicates that it will be premature for the central bank to think of cutting rates now in the first half of the year, because as political risk escalates, as other fiscal risks also go elevated, then investors should naturally demand higher yields, because that's the only way to attract the carry trade into Nigeria.
The CBN, the monetary authorities, will focus on the inflation targets, keeping an eye on inflation.
Inflation target, exchange rate stability. To do that, we need higher yields. And higher yields means that if we borrow more, then we're going to pay a higher borrowing cost. Remember, we're already spending 50% of revenues on interest payments alone.
It just looks, there's this divergence between monetary authorities and fiscal.
Yes, exactly. And that's because fiscal authorities aren't carrying out the kinds of reforms they should. Concessioning of assets, sale of assets to fund the deficits. Because when you do that, then you can increase government intake inflows, and then you can turn some of these moribund companies into tax-generating companies.
But they're also trying, I mean, there's that fierce tax drive to raise tax revenues.
Yes, but it's from the same people. What about government SOEs that are performing below standard? There are quite a number of them. Like we just mentioned the refineries a few minutes ago. IOCs aren't investing as much as they can because NNPC isn't funding. So all these fiscal opportunities, we can actually, things are bad, but we're just one reform away from turning things around.